My name is Mary Potter Kenyon. I am a certified grief educator trained under world-renowned grief expert David Kessler. I'm an author. I do workshops on creativity, grief. I founded an annual grief retreat and a writers' conference. My story begins being raised in a large family with very little money, and I ended up having a very large family myself. I got married a year out of high school, and we had 8 children. And one creative thing I hung on to was my writing. So I've been writing freelance for probably 35 years. That was the one creative outlet I hung on to as a mother raising young children and homeschooling. I was widowed in 2012 and thrust into a state of stillness and sadness that I'd never before experienced. And in the process, my journey of grief became one of faith. My mother had died 17 months before my husband. My grandson would die 17 months after. I wrote about that in one of my books. I wrote about my journey of grief and grace. But the book that is the most recent book, Called to be Creative, A Guide to Reigniting Your Creativity, is one that means so much to me. I began it a month after my mother died. My mother had been such a creative woman, raising 10 children in poverty, but yet she managed to beautify our home with beautiful wall hangings, wood carvings, quilts, rag rugs, handmade dolls. And when she passed away, I believe she left me a legacy of faith and creativity. I had always been using my creativity as a writer, but I was convinced after her death that everybody had it in them to be creative. And that began me on a journey of looking into creativity and studying the science of creativity and reading 65 plus books on creativity for the next 10 years. I would do that before I actually sat down and wrote the book Called to be Creative, A Guide to Reigniting Your Creativity. During that time, I had to become creative. As a new widow, I had to find a job outside of the home. I was still homeschooling my children. My first job outside of the home was with a library where I was able to bring my youngest daughters with me. And I became convinced not only that God had plans for me, but part of that plan was to encourage other women, encourage other grievers. And so that is when I became certified as a grief counselor. It's also when I began speaking to groups of women, some at one end of the spectrum with young children who said they didn't have time to be creative, and yet they found time to encourage their children to be creative. And women at the other end of the spectrum, women and men, but especially women at the other end of the spectrum who said, I don't have any creativity, or worse, it's too late for me now. So thus the seeds of this book were planted. I was doing research. The book I began in 2017 when I was between jobs, a job that was killing me creatively, and going to a different job, which would be less money and no insurance, but would allow me to be more creative. So it was during that time that I actually picked up pen and paper and began writing this book. The main core message of Called to be Creative is that we are designed to be creative, that we have a creator who designed us to be creative. Not only that, he designed us to live a life that would become his masterpiece. And there's science behind it. And so my book has some research in it. It has some encouraging stories of other people who work creativity into their life. It has encouragement, inspiration. Each chapter ends with some inspirational message and some activity for the reader to try, bringing creativity back into their life. My advice to anyone who believes they don't have a creative bone in their body is to look back to your childhood. Look back to your childhood and remember what it was that made you feel alive. Because when we go back to what we were designed to do, our purpose, our passion, and we start working that into our lives as adults, we will be healthier, we will be happier, and we can create the life that God designed us to create, the life that becomes His masterpiece. You can learn more about me at marypotterkenyon.com. I'm on Instagram, Mary Potter Kenyon, and I'm on Facebook, Mary Potter Kenyon. And I hope you have a more creative day and a more creative life.